Hello everybody, welcome back to lecture series number 4. Excuse me. Oh, goodness gracious me. Great timing as soon as I start recording. This is strategic leadership as part of the MBA course, and we are on lecture series number 4, leadership and ethics. This is probably one of the most important lecture series. We started off by looking at the different definitions and so on, but this is the bit that where the rubber hits the road, where we begin to consider what leadership means to those that are followers and to society at large. The impact that we have as leaders, particularly thinking about what that means. And so we're going to start off by talking about power. We're going to go into this in a lot more detail. We did pick up on this in previous lectures, but we're going to go into in a lot more detail. Don't forget that you'll have 10 sessions as part of this lecture series 4. And at the end of every single one of those sessions, we will have your usual multiple choice questionnaires to consolidate your learning. So this is a little bit about me. What about my knowledge or my experience of power? I've worked in a number of positions within the charitable sector. I was an associate. I was an associate director, an assistant director for training and development for a big charity in the UK. Yes, my experience of leadership, particularly in this particular organization, those that were right at the top in this particular charity could self-regulate. They looked after their own ethics. At this time of recording, that particular charity, the head, the CEO, has actually resigned due to ethical issues within the organization that they themselves are not regulating accordingly, and there's a call for the removal of this kind of self-regulation. So I am not just talking about power in leadership from a theoretical point of view. I have experienced it myself, the temptation to abuse your position, to use it for your own gain, but also being under the power and authority of those who, again, have abused those, particularly in the area of knowledge. Now, I play a game when I do any kind of leadership training. I play a game called the marble game. And basically what I do is I break people up into groups, and then I give the leader, I appoint a leader normally. I keep an eye on them for a couple of days. And they get given a glass of marbles. Now, these marbles represent delegated authority. Then the leader chooses how he hands out the marbles. He or she hands out the marbles. You have to have a marble to be able to be part of the communication, and I give the groups a task. You can only communicate to people that are on the same level as you or below you. So if I had one marble, I could only talk to other people who have one marble or people who have no marbles. But people with no marbles can't talk to me, right? It's kind of trying to force this layering of authority. It was very interesting to watch the delegated leaders in the way in which they handed out marbles. I remember doing this in a big construction company in Saudi, and the group leader dished out marbles, took them away, dished out, took them away, dished out. So he was very dynamic in the way in which he was using the delegated authority. Never seen that before. I thought it was really good. Other leaders kind of handed out and they stuck to it. Others just wanted to hand out equally. Let's not upset people. And what was really interesting as well, I've done this in the UK and I did it in Saudi, the differences in the culture. In the UK, everybody just wanted to be equal, but actually the process of communication didn't work properly. Whereas in Saudi, they were a lot more dynamic and on top of it. So we're going to think about all of these kind of things, particularly in terms of power. So you will know by now that we have 4 learning outcomes. So this is the last learning outcome that we are specifically addressing. The 5th one is a consolidation of all of these 4 learning outcomes. That will be lecture series number 5. So here we are, understanding ethical decision making and organizational value. Don't forget, obviously, we have the assessment at the end of all of this, a case study, an essay, and a presentation file with speaker notes. As always, I will go through the assessments in session 10, making links to the content. Right, so this is the lecture series. We've covered the principles, concepts, and approaches of leadership. We've looked at leadership and influence, leadership and performance. We're now looking at leadership and ethics. So the ethics and the value-laden influences that shape and influence leadership within organizations. So these are the assessed learning outcomes for each one of these big learning outcomes. Here we want to think about leadership, power, and influence. We're also interested in ethics, values, and corporate social responsibility. We're also wanting to look at how to evaluate leadership and its sustainability, and then some of the trends within ethics and values within leadership. But this particular session, session 1, we're going to be looking at leadership, power, and its influence. Right, so our core text, we're going to be referring to Northouse here again, and we're looking at power types. Right, so let's get stuck in. So the concept of power is related to leadership because it is part of the influence process. And here I've underlined it. Power is the capacity or potential to influence. The power or capacity, the potential or capacity to influence. Now, that could be voluntarily in the sense that people allow themselves to be influenced. It also could be coercion. You have to, because if you don't, I will, right? And we're going to think about that in terms of how that power is being used. And again, you can see here where the styles of, for example, transformational leadership versus that of transactional leadership comes into play. People have power when they have the ability to affect others' beliefs, attitudes, and courses of action. We're going to come back to this when we go into this in a lot more detail. Understanding how power is used in leadership is instrumental. And again, the abuse of this power is what leads to the dark side of leadership called the dark triad. And again, we're going to go into that in lecture series number 5. We're going to go into that in a lot more detail. Power used to the domain of leaders. Power used to be, it used to be the domain of leaders, but with followership, and we particularly see it in politics at the moment, if we don't trust, that power can be taken away. And followers now have quite a lot of power in the way in which they legitimate the leaders' influence and power. And this has been quite a radical change in the way in which power is being used. Can you think of examples where power has been used? I shared a couple from my own background. I'm sure you can. We're not, isolated and hidden from the effects of power in leadership. All right, well, we're going to go into these in a lot more detail. We're going to have a session all on its own, looking at these concepts from French and Raven, and we'll define each one of these individually. But here in session 1, we're just introducing these because these are quite core. When we're thinking about power, these are the core ones that we're thinking about. So we're thinking here about referent power, expert power, legitimate power, reward power, coercive power, and the power of information. Now, the last one is a recent one that's been added by French and Raven, but you'll also see later on that there are others that have now been added in more contemporary times. What I want you to notice, look at the diagram at the bottom right-hand corner. The power here, and bearing in mind that information power is new, so it's not listed here. There's 6 that's listed on the left-hand side, but only 5 in the diagram for the moment. What we can see here is that legitimate, coercive, and reward power is related to a position and a role. This is my marble game. You are delegated this power, right? It's delegated authority, and with that authority, you can then exercise power, right? But it's linked to position and role. Somebody off the street can't just walk up to me and start to tell me what I need to do. I'm like, well, who are you? What power do you have over me, right? The legitimacy of that kind of role, that position, enables that kind of power to be exerted. It's delegated. The other 2 elements, the expert and the referent, this is personal power. So this is where a person has a level of influence and power because of who they are as people. And again, as I said, we'll go into this in a lot more detail in a later session. I just wanted to introduce these ideas for you. In session 3, we will explore these by looking at each definition and again, making connections in the real world of leadership with regards to these. So again, let's just summarize what I've just said. So there's 2 kinds of power. There's the power that comes from position and there's the power that comes from you as a person. Position power, this includes legitimate, reward, and coercive, and we can now put the information in here as well, right? Because that person, it's delegated authority, you are in the know, and therefore it's what you share being in the know. So this is derived from a particular office or rank. Think, for example, in terms of position, think about somebody in the military. Right, that's a really good example. Your commanding officer. Now, they're the commanding officer because of their rank and their position. And when they tell you to jump, you ask them how high. But personal power, think, for example, of religious leaders. People have given them legitimate power because of their charisma, their ethics, their values, and they go on a regular basis, whether it's to the mosque on a Friday, to a church on a Sunday, to the synagogue on a Friday, and they allow themselves to be influenced by what is being said by the religious leader. Right? That's personal power. Right, and of course, again, we have a little table there to summarize that for us. So the different power types, let's just run through these again, just as an introduction. So coercive power, so if we go, coercive power is one of the specific kinds of power available to leader. Now, coercion involves the use of force to effect change, the use of force. To coerce means to influence others to do something against their will. And this may include manipulating penalties and rewards. In other words, what we're describing here is transactional leadership. Now, again, this does not necessarily mean that transactional leadership is a negative thing. In certain contexts, it works, particularly in terms of hierarchy and so on. But when it is used in a bad way, to force, particularly when it's about the person and not about the productivity within a company, it falls into the dark side of leadership. Now, again, coercive power is quite often, coercive power and transactional leadership is quite evident in hierarchies because of those ranks and those positions. There are two consistent trains of thought, therefore, regarding leadership, right? Is leadership a neutral process that is not guided or dependent on a value system? You have a job to do and you get on and do it. Or there is a view that leadership actually is a moral process because you're influencing people at the end of the day. And therefore, your internal value clock has to be guided in order for you not to end up in the dark triad, the dark side of leadership. This particular lecture series would lean towards the latter. And it's not just about getting on with the job. I personally don't believe you can separate your character from your skills. They're part and parcel of the two. If you are able to hide your character, that's actually quite deceptive. And again, we'll go into this in lecture series number 5 when we look at the dark triad. Right, so obviously in coercion, there's a lot of politics that is involved. So if we think about politics, politicians, there's the struggle for influence and power, accountability, and we see this through elections, advocacy, lobbying, negotiations, and so on and so on. Within an organization, we see the same kind of politics at play, organizational politics. And again, this is the use of power and influence tactics in order to get your decisions made or for you to progress and to advance in your career. It's defined in terms of the manager's motives, which is why, again, we would lean towards more of an ethical approach in leadership. Those motives, if they are selfish, about the values, the use of power will be in a negative way and will be about the individual leader's power. So here we have it. We have power, the capacity of people or organizations to direct or affect the actions of others. Politics, the processes, actions, and the dynamics in the way in which this would be made, particularly in terms of negotiation, decision-making, and so on. And of course, not everyone is going to go along, so therefore you have conflict, and quite often the conflict is as a result of values. There are many different ways that conflict can appear, interpersonal, corporate, and even global in terms of that kind of conflict. And this is all part of leadership and ethics. Right. as we come into land, we want to again just think about these different power types. We're going to go into this, as I said, in a lot more detail in the sessions to come. In some research done in 2008, so this is more than 10 years old now, the significance of political behavior in change is widely acknowledged. So 60% of those who've been surveyed agreed that politics becomes more important as organizational change becomes more complex. And we're talking politics here in terms of organizational politics. So where change begins to happen and it becomes more complex, people losing jobs, hire and firing, advancements, trying to save budgets, etc., etc. The politics, the negotiations, the decision making becomes more important, which is true. I can think of a myriad of organizations that I've been in where there has been a drastic change, either due to economics or the survival of the organization or controversy, and the politics at that point, you know, at the apex of that change was really important, and emotions ran high. 79% surveyed agreed that politics can be used to initiate and drive useful change initiatives. So again, you know, about getting buy-in, getting ownership, selling the ideas, selling the values in order to drive those changes. Organizational politics, again, was used and in a positive way. 81% agreed, and you'll notice the percentages are going up here. 81% agreed that political tactics in organizations can be effective in dealing with resistance to change. I had when working for a charity, I had a particular man who was always resisting things, and he was a very interesting character. His value system was a little bit warped in the sense that he would be nice to your face, but then completely be negative without you around, and, you know, put knives in your back. And my particular tactic I discovered to control him was his wife. Now, because I worked in a charity, a community charity, I ran a toddler group. This is many, many, many years ago. I ran a toddler group with his wife. She loved the fact that I was supporting her. The toddler group was growing in popularity within the community, and she really liked me. And she didn't want me to be upset. She thought I was a good thing for the charity. And so when her husband upset me, she got upset. And I learned to use her, in inverted commas, as a tactic to keep him under control. Now, it doesn't mean that I didn't listen to any of his critique, because that's important and it's accountability, but in most cases it was about him. And he was a negative force within the organization and wanting the organization to move forward and change. 92% of those surveyed agreed that politics, again, within organizations can be used to slow down and block useful change initiatives. And this quite often can be seen when people rally. They gather people who agree with them, and they begin to create factions of resistance within organizations, and that's really very difficult to deal with. Again, in these kind of charities that I worked in, the charity splitting was quite a common phenomena due to these kinds of things. All right, so that was a little bit of an introduction around power types. We've looked particularly at French and Raven and the various power types that they've introduced us to, and then we've looked at organizational politics in terms of how these power types may be used either through position or through personal power. We're going to start going into these in a lot more detail as we go through the various sessions. So that's it. That's a good introduction. Let's stop there. Do go and do the multiple choice questionnaire to consolidate your understanding and your learning.